Blockchain has planted an aspiration for decentralized apps, but it's not always easy to deliver that on blockchain. It's expensive with gas fees, or you have scaling problems, or so. Um, Even though there's a lot of apps that have been built on blockchain, there aren't many that are getting a lot of use a lot of the time. Like most of it is dexes and gambling and that kind of stuff, because we've kind of gotten so caught up in the tokenization of the chains instead of like the intrinsic data integrity that lets us do everything.
Arthur Brock, welcome to What Kind of Internet Do You Want? Really glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Amy. It's good to be here.
So, before we dive into Holochain, I would just love to hear about you, what your background is, and why you work in Web3.
Uh, I have a bit of an eclectic background. I usually have made my money doing software stuff and some complex software architecture solutions and weird projects in alternative currencies. I've been building alternative currencies since about 2001, community currencies, hundreds of actually very different types of things. In fact, when I talk about currency, means something much more than money. And I'm trying to reclaim that word to be more connected to its Latin roots about flow, and think of it more like current C, like the tools that we use to be able to collectively shape flows together. And so those become tools for collective intelligence. And I think we are facing all kinds of challenges in collective intelligence. And so I do weird social hacking projects, culture hacking projects. I started a network of alternative schools, a social enterprise incubator, all kinds of different things. And Holochain is a technology for for building those kinds of social coherence, for building new ways that we can coordinate and orchestrate together. So my background, I do have a degree in artificial intelligence that I don't use, uh, and one in religious studies too. Don't use that much either. But
Interesting that those kind of go together in a weird way,
don't
eh?
they? Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about Holochain at kind of like a high level overview. How do you explain it to a non technical person?
I think how I would describe it is it's part of the evolution of the internet in terms of, I feel like we really are targeting it to be Web3, and the kind of infrastructure that Web2 needed. We had to virtualize the machine, right? So cloud computing actually virtualized the machine so you could run 20 virtual machines on one hardware box, or maybe one virtual machine across 20 hardware boxes, or right, so that you could actually you could deal with the different kinds of scale that companies needed based on their load and demands, and all of that kind of thing. So you could spread it across hardware, you could cluster and spread across data centers, all that kind of stuff. That was scaling, but it was still all scaling in centralized infrastructure. And so Holochain, instead of it being about scaling the machine, it's really about virtualizing the application. So the application runs across many machines instead of in one space. Um, I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay. So what was it that inspired you to create it? Was there a specific problem? Was it a series of problems?
Well, I mentioned my interest in collective intelligence. Part of this actually came out of a project called the Metacurrency Project, which really goes into really geeky currency design principles and incentive design and all sorts of stuff from that sense that I was talking about the word currency in a broader sense than just money. And we were looking for how can we build the infrastructure that we need to use to activate currencies as these kind of coordination tools. And it yielded a crazy project called Scepter, CEPTR, short for Receptor. You can think of it as a complete rebuild of our computing, communications, and currency stack from the feminine receptive capacity instead of from the masculine, I'll call it expressive capacity, like the ontological things of what exists. It's the space of possibility for what can exist. And it makes it a very different, non brittle, resilient kind of architecture. But it's crazy and weird, and nobody understands it. And it kind of involves, the more you know about computers, the harder it is to understand, because it kind of involves like 18 paradigm shifts for how we currently do computing. So we took just two of those and decided to do a small project and call it something chain to, because the parts we were taking had to do with the decentralization, um, and be able to put that adjacent to blockchain. We chose Holochain because of the holographic nature of Holochain, the resiliency to partitioning. Like when you take a photograph and you cut it in half, you get two different, so you get two halves of a photo. When you take a holograph or hologram and cut it in half, you get one photo from two slightly different angles, right? So you still get
Hmm.
the whole. And so Holochain, the way that it's set up, is extremely resilient to partitioning. In fact, it's a local first kind of functionality. Depending on the rules in your app, you might be able to use it completely offline without any internet, and then it would synchronize later when you get back online. Um, and so it's very resilient to partitioning. You know, if you were running some big global system on it, and you could somehow bring down all the transatlantic, transpacific, and satellite, communications between the hemispheres would keep functioning as if they had, a full app. They just couldn't be having new communications with each other, and some of those may get queued and stored and for synchronization later. But you would not have very many conflicts to resolve when that, if you ran Twitter like this for a week, and then the partition was healed and the system merged, the only conflicts would be registration of new usernames that might have bumped
Mm-hmm.
into each other, because none of the other data is rivalrous data.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the decentralized architectures that we have right now, blockchain in particular, treats everything like we need consensus about everything as if it's rivalrous, when most of our data, if we actually are talking about practical usage applications, isn't rivalrous.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's good to have a platform that can give you that flexibility. And we really were trying to, we may have even erred on the side of too much composability and flexibility to make different kinds of patterns with Holochain, so that the learning curve can be a little steep to realize all the options, to sort through all the options you have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. That's interesting. So get into some of the details that technical folks would appreciate. You know, what it's not on a blockchain, but it does use a chain. Tell us more about how the system works.
Yeah. So Holochain, those sort of two um, paradigm shifts. One of them is agent-centric architecture. And what that means is each agent, each person who can act and make changes to the system, has their own chain, which is only a history of their actions, nobody else's actions, just your kind of append only log, except it's an append only hash chain. So the chain part comes from the the structure of appending entries together with headers that have hashes, such that you basically create an immutable history. Because if you were to go back and change any of the entries, you would break all the hashes in the chain. And that's where the chain language comes from. It's you're using cryptographic hashes as sort of unique identifiers for fingerprints for the data. So if the data changes at all, it breaks the fingerprint, which then uh, goes right up the chain, breaking the following fingerprints. And you can tell if even, you just changed one comma to a period in a 700-page document or something like that, you get a completely different fingerprint. You break all the hashes, you know that the data has been tampered with. And for me, this is really the key thing. Sorry, brief digression, is that I feel like we're kind of forgetting to emphasize in blockchain land, is that what the breakthrough with that cryptography has given us is really what I would call intrinsic data integrity. It doesn't
Mm,
matter who's holding the data. You can know that it hasn't been tampered with. You can know that it still has its original integrity. And so what we're really focused on in Holochain is taking advantage of that for building Web3 apps, for building peer-to-peer apps. And Holochain is the decentralized data engine underneath those apps. Um,
okay. So, a couple of questions. Um, do users of the apps, must you have your own chain, or can you participate in an app without having your own chain?
um, the short answer is yes, you must. um, However, if an application has had some user that creates some public gateway that might create read only visibility into a space, then
Okay.
no, you would have like a window into a space. So you might have read only visibility. If they have been extremely clumsy and have created a read write gateway that's open to the public, now that user will be held accountable for any actions anybody does through their gateway and may get themselves dropped and blocked
Danger.
because Holochain
Mm-hmm.
has an immune system against malicious actions. So, uh, so if you're just using Holochain, yes, you need to run your own instance because it's peer to peer and you self host. And literally, if you've made a web UI, you point your browser at localhost, at a port on localhost.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then Holochain is the database underneath that UI and the application code that's actually doing all the magic of, making sure that the chains are signed and the hashes are not broken. And I mentioned that each agent has their own chain. We call that actually a source chain because all data is sourced from a source chain, but then it is published to a shared space, which is a DHT, a distributed hash table. And so that means you're using these cryptographic hashes as lookup keys for data in a database that can be spread across many computers, and nobody needs to hold it all. We already know how to shard DHTs quite effectively, much easier than sharding global state in a blockchain. So Holochain has a lot of ways of dividing up the work to keep the load really light per user so that it's not a burden for a user to run. That said,
Okay.
one more caveat. Holochain came with another project that we've done called Holo Hosting. And Holochain doesn't have a currency. It doesn't have a native token. There's no gas fees. There's no anything like that. You only run the apps you want to run because you want to run them. So we don't have to give you an incentive to run them. Every app is its own peer-to-peer encrypted network. So if you want to
Okay.
run a Twitter on Holochain type app, you're just running that app, not every other app in the ecosystem. So you're
Mm-hmm.
only carrying the workload of what you chose to carry. And
Makes sense.
so that allows us to keep it really light. But Holo hosting is a pure hosting network that can serve Holochain apps to general web users and give them like a Web 2 like experience
Mm-hmm.
of accessing a Holochain app. But what that means is there's a network of boxes that are actually running a Holochain instance for you, and you hold your keys. They don't have your keys. They can't write to your chain. The host can't write to your chain. And there
Okay.
is a currency for the Holo hosting network. And we actually did an ICO with that currency using an ERC20 token for later doing a swap into the native currency on the network. And we haven't done that swap yet because the network is only in alpha, not in beta, the hosting network.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So, uh, tell me about the distinction between, let's say, public data and private data. It sounds like most of the use case of the is for public data, right? Because if it's data that I'm putting out that somebody else is authenticating or verifying, I suppose, then it would be for public data. Where would my private data? Yeah.
Yeah. So remember, I mentioned that maybe we've erred on the side of too much composability, too many options. We have
Uh-huh.
a lot of options with regard to this. So
Okay.
if you're talking about an app like Twitter, which is largely intended for public data anyway, like you're shoutcasting to the world, right? But
Mhm.
maybe you want to have private messages between people that aren't being published to the DHT, you can write private entries to your chain. The headers are published so that you can see continuity of the chain, but the content of the entry is not published to the DHT. So,
Okay.
so you can have private entries on your chain, even in a very wide open, like shout to the whole world kind of DHT that may have no membership boundaries. Maybe anybody can join. You don't care about Sybil accounts or anything like that. But we also have it so that you can have manage the membranes of an application quite variably. You can basically you have a joining validation process when you create your key pair. Your public key becomes your address in the chain when you try to in that space in the app. When you try to publish your public key, you have to basically show your right to join the space in the entry right before it and in your chain, and so that might be an invitation code. It might be a proof of stake. It might be a proof of work for joining or something that you had to generate a difficult key to join, or, there's a lot
Hmm.
of different options for joining.
Hmm.
Um, so those can be very tight and private. And you can compose apps together. So you could have a healthcare app, for example, where my personal healthcare data is stored on, 4 nodes. My laptop, my Raspberry Pi, my wife and my mom are running a node so that other people have my data in case I'm unconscious and somebody needs to share my healthcare data or something like that, right? But only
Mhm.
4 nodes in that whole personal data app, but it's connected at the edge to a much larger app that has all the doctors and hospitals and other people so that you can transfer data to each other, but you never store data in that app. And all the transfers are just like everything in Holochain are always encrypted on the wire. And so, you can compose these kinds of membranes together in lots of different ways. So no, it's not just for public data. It's also for private data and for secret data. And then you also have the option of encrypting things that you would put even in a shared space. So,
Of course, but that opens up a whole other question about whether or not encrypted data should be private data should be encrypted and then in a public space because it's just sort of a time delay to accessing it, right?
completely
Okay.
agree.
So um okay, interesting. So because Holochain is so different in the world of Web3 projects, I wonder what you would say, are there Web2 things that you would like be, I don't know if you call them competitors or just sort of like analogs, to the services that you're offering?
Web 2 analogs?
Web Web
Um,
2 is the first question, and then yeah.
yeah, Web 2, it would be hard to view much as Web 2 is very similar because Holochain's so decentralized, completely peer to peer, that it's hard to compare it to much. But if you wanted to run Wikipedia or, as I mentioned before, Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media, those big Web 2 apps that we are the ones who bring the data to,
Mhm.
that really it's about us connecting with each other anyway. Holochain gives you the opportunity to just take out the middlemen. You don't need a Facebook
Mhm.
corporation in the middle, and you don't need miners or stakers in the middle.
But where is the data itself living? Like in Web 2, that data is living in data centers that are controlled by those companies. And so that's sort of the concern, right? Is not just that they control the terms of the app by which you access the data, but they control the access to the data itself. Is that just
Yeah.
something that you decide when you're building an app in Holochain about where you want the data to live?
Uh, Mostly, I mean, yes, kind of. You can do some tweaks to some things, but generally speaking, every node, every user is running their own node and hosting themselves. but that is a negligible workload. So running
Hmm.
blockchains is heavy because of all of the consensus management that has to happen. And not just for proof of work, just because if you're going to try to keep 10,000 nodes in sync, that's a lot of work all on its own, even without wasting computation on hash cracking, right? So um, with Holochain, we're not managing a global consensus. One of the things is that we would suggest Holochain is modeled on the natural world. It's actually modeled on the way physics and biology work. Uh, the cells in my body are not synchronizing their state against a global cell ledger, right? Each cell is embodying its own state locally, and then it
Mm-hmm.
has coordination protocols for interfacing with the other cells.
Mm-hmm.
So your question was, where's the data? The answer is you're
Like,
running a
meaning,
node.
am I storing it on IPFS? Am I storing it on Arweave? Am I storing it in
No,
some sort of
Holochain. You're
AWS
storing
kind
it
of
locally.
thing?
You're storing it locally. So the app has two faces to it, sort of two sides of a coin. One is your local chain, and then the other is your shard of the DHT, right? So the
Okay.
DHT can be broken up across all of the users into very small pieces, and then you store and validate stored and validate data that is within sort of the range of your slice of the pie of the DHT. And you can
What
set
happens when I don't have enough ability to store all of my data on my computer?
all of your own
I don't.
data on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't
Mm-hmm.
store your own source chain on your computer, then you have a problem. If you can't keep your own record of your actions, then you really have a problem. You probably can't be using Holochain.
Okay.
But if you can't,
Okay.
but but if you're talking about, I mean, but Holochain is actually really lightweight, and I think even able to run on IoT devices because we understand that devices have different capacities, and you can actually set your capacities. So you could say, I have zero room to store DHT data, so my arc of the DHT that I'm going to store is a zero-sized arc, right? So
Okay.
you can say, I can't store anyone else's data, but I'm still responsible for my state. So if I can't store my state, I can't participate.
So, like we make a lot of video content, right? So we actually do have enough now hardware to store it all here locally, but there have been times when we weren't able to do that, so we would use outside, infrastructure for that to store it. Like think about like your iPhotos library. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
can't store that on their computer. That's kind of what I'm meaning here. Like I guess that would be stored somewhere else, but then that I'm storing it would be in my chain or something like that, a hash to it?
Um,
Or am I getting that wrong?
I mean, you could theoretically do those things if you wanted to. The
But it's just not
what
intended for that, maybe?
It's not really intended for that. And I think
Okay.
what you would do instead is if you were building something like a YouTube app because you're doing video content, big, heavy content,
Mhm.
what you would do is actually break that into multiple apps. And you'd have a viewer app, an uploader app, a media server app, and a probably an indexer, search indexer app, right? And you'd have different nodes that are carrying different levels of responsibility. Everybody runs the viewer app, which is how you communicate with the other nodes. So how you can request data, how you can do searches with the indexes and then make the requests from the media servers and then, that kind of stuff. But that, so you would kind of create a division of labor so that nobody has to carry a bigger portion of the load than they're really set up to. Um,
Okay.
and and so there are ways to divide up the work within Holochain in terms of how you structure your app. And you would want nodes that have big network attached storage devices and good backbone, you know, high throughput bandwidth for streaming being your media servers. You probably don't want to try to serve from people's cell phones your YouTube videos, right? So
Right.
that's part of why you would kind of divide and conquer that way. And so what would
Okay, that
happen
makes
is
sense.
the uploader app would actually send it as a message, rather than store it, keeping it to their chain. They would store a record of the message they sent, but they would send it as a message to a media server app, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So, what other Web3 protocols does Holochain work with at this point, or would be great kind of fits for working together in that regard?
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been some integration projects at different times. There's one project out of Germany with one of our former developers, Nicholas Luck, called Flux, that he has been making with his team. He's been making a kind of chain agnostic system that leans on Holochain pretty heavily, but also integrates with IPFS and is supposed to integrate with other chains. And I don't even know which ones it integrates with right now, but he's created a whole abstraction model for building applications across multiple chains and having them work together effectively. That's one. We have a new project. I don't even remember the name of it. It's so new because we're about to demo it in London in a few weeks. But it's in partnership with the Rain protocol, and it's actually for NFT coordination because um, it's about using Holochain essentially as your side chain for storage of NFTs that actually gives you the data storage guarantees, but also the validation rules so that you can make sure that the owner, you can, people store things on IPFS, but IPFS doesn't do validation. It doesn't know whether or not you have any right to do any of the things that you're doing or things like that. And so it's a way Holochain is bridging to EVM uh, chain protocols in this scenario to provide chain storage for NFT market type stuff. And I wish I could remember the name of the project. I actually just saw it in a chat today, but I've forgotten what it was called.
That's
Um,
okay. We can put it in the show notes if you let us know after. Okay, okay, interesting. Um, so, hmm, because it's so different, I wonder where you have seen success, like what projects are being built with it that seem to be a great fit for it, and also how, you said you've been involved in incentive conversations seemingly before Bitcoin became a thing. And so, what about the incentives of Holochain will help to, get it to that kind of mainstream adoption?
yeah. Um, you're also reminding me, and maybe this is what you were fishing for with the Web 2 sort of parallels question. Maybe the way to think of Holochain just as a simplified story, instead of thinking of it like a blockchain, think of it more like Git plus BitTorrent. So Git is
Hmm.
like your own hashed store where you're writing your local changes for what you're editing. But then instead of sharing with your collaborators through a centralized GitHub, imagine you
Hmm.
had a BitTorrent kind of engine for sharing the pieces with each other. That's far more the architecture of Holochain. So that might help
That makes
people kind
sense.
of understand
Yeah,
the integrity
that's a good
guarantees.
mental model for it. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and then in answer to your other question, what was the other
Which was
question?
about how it has been used successfully, or how you imagine it will be used successfully, and the incentives behind driving that forward.
Yeah. So there've been a lot of interesting and weird projects and sometimes surprising projects built on Holochain because it is so weirdly flexible and composable. So people actually have built like video live streaming that actually commits to the DHT, and you can read from the DHT like 30 seconds to a minute behind the stream, and people build real time interaction, real time things. We have real time document editing, that kind of thing that you
Oh,
can do
cool.
on Holochain,
Like Google Docs.
like Google Docs. Yeah. And
Love that.
real time like Trello boards and things where you drag the cards over and they move for everyone. Shared project management tools. We have a Twitter clone called Muse feed, like a cat goes mew, birds go tweet, cats go mew, Muse feed. Um, and I don't know. There are no quote incentives on Holochain because there's no token, right? It is a distributed database engine. So it's free, open source, held by a nonprofit foundation, has no hooks into venture capital or anything like that. It is completely community raised funds. So it is a publicly held, big kind of infrastructure project. And I think the incentives are that there's interest and passion, there's aspiration. Like blockchain has planted an aspiration for decentralized apps, but it's not always easy to deliver that on blockchain. It's expensive with gas fees, or you have scaling problems, or so. Um, Even though there's a lot of apps that have been built on blockchain, there aren't many that are getting a lot of use a lot of the time, right? Like, um, and I'm not talking. The storage is another category. There are storage apps that get use, so I don't want to say nothing does, but like most of it is dexes and gambling and that kind of stuff because we've kind of gotten so caught up in the tokenization of the chains instead of like the intrinsic data integrity that lets us do everything. And so
Totally.
with Holochain, it's weird because people just go do everything. We actually had a last week a game like game building fest, and somebody built a zero knowledge proof battleship app, so that you can make the commits, but to private entries, and then do a zero knowledge proof of whether or not it was a hit or a miss of my battleships, of my ships, for instance. And
That's
it's
fun.
pretty cool to
Yeah.
see the creativity of what people bring.
Yeah, yeah. It definitely seems like the people that are attracted to Holochain have that kind of like open source, in it for the ethos, hacker heart, like, but I guess where I'm concerned about how that then goes mainstream and becomes something that we could all depend on ongoingly is, people forget that that people actually need to constantly maintain software in order for it to continue working over time,
Yeah.
right? And Bitcoin itself has the Bitcoin core developers, and there hasn't really been there wasn't an intrinsic system to support those people. And so kind of an ad hoc network has been built up to make sure that they get paid, to make sure that there's a legal defense fund for them, all of those kinds of things. But that the ongoing problem that we've seen since the beginning of the web is that continuing to maintain and upgrade open source software is a lot like herding cats, in that there is difficulty with accountability for moving things forward, or keeping a timeline, that kind of thing, and then also just like being severely underfunded, the way that nonprofit work often finds itself to be. And
Yeah.
that it seemed like potentially with blockchain there was this way that we could incentivize open source in a new way that had a mechanism in order to continue to support its ongoing maintenance and
Yeah.
evolution. And so I just wonder what you guys are thinking about in terms of how you're going to address that for Holochain, because it kind of does seem like a problem for the way you've designed
Yeah,
the incentive.
absolutely. I mean, Holochain is a big open source infrastructure project. Open source infrastructure is expensive to maintain. Absolutely correct, right? You have to have a revenue model for that. And that's part of why I mentioned earlier that Holochain was co-emergent with the Holo hosting network. So the Holochain Foundation
Okay.
actually owns 100% of the Holo hosting network. The Holo hosting network has a token, has a revenue model, gets actually is a peer hosting network where people pay the peers directly, but they accrue transaction fees that get paid 1% transaction fees that get paid to the Holo hosting organization when you hit thresholds that require payment. And that's one of many other kinds of revenue models that we're putting underneath Holochain. So Holochain actually owns these things so that there is a revenue model for them, and truly our aspiration with something like the Holo hosting network is to take on Amazon, Google, AWS, Azure, the big
Hmm.
hosting, like to be able to do hosting at that scale, but similar to how like Airbnb has taken on all the biggest hotel chains, sells more room nights, but it's never had to build a hotel. We think we can, but through Holochain apps, where Holochain is handling the scaling between peer nodes, allows us to put those peer nodes anywhere. So we've sold thousands of them in 68 different countries, and you just plug it into your internet router, and you're running a hosting node. And we have sort of deals in the hopper that we're not ready to move forward on yet because we haven't launched the network. But we have deals in the hopper of places that are like uh, parking lot companies that have 60,000 parking lots, and they have those kiosks with electricity and internet in a parking lot. And they're like, what else can we do with a kiosk that has electricity and internet to make money? It's like, so we've got like groups that want to install 60,000 hosting boxes, but we don't have a demand yet to feed 60,000
Mm-hmm.
hosting boxes, right? So we have the possibility of having the hosting network blow up huge to be able to take on like real large hosting companies, but in the Airbnb model, where it's like your spare room, it's the box plugged into your router or in the parking lot kiosk,
That's
Um,
awesome. Yeah, I love that. I once read that the amount of storage capacity on all of our computers at home and all of the, kind of devices that we have is larger than the amount collectively owned by, the big three who own all of the kind of infrastructure data warehouses. Uh, I can't re-find that article that I read that said that. So if anyone out there can, please drop it in the comments for us. I would love to be able to cite it. Um, so I love the vision. I know you guys have been selling the Hollowport machines. Does the infrastructure only run on those machines, or could I run it on my devices at home?
We had a couple of small waves of selling boxes. We're not a hardware company. I think one of the lessons, and we knew that up front, but one of the lessons is we really are partnering with other people to do hardware sales. And we've kind of halted all of that until the Holo hosting network is launched. And we have a few partners in the wings ready to launch their Holoports. We also have somebody in the wings that has basically been building an installer for the hosting software um, on a USB drive that also functions as your sort of headless indicator. These devices we built had a fancy LED that would tell you what was going on, even if you didn't have a screen or monitor connected, right? So it would tell
Makes
you if the
sense.
system was good or what kind of errors are happening and that kind of stuff. And so that's being built into a USB drive, and that way you can repurpose your old laptop or old desktop or other hardware that you want to and install the hosting tools there. But remember, that's all for the Holo hosting network. Holo chain you can run right on whatever device you're using. I say whatever with a little bit of a grain of salt, in that we haven't really perfected it on mobile yet, because Holochain is a gossiping application, so it's kind of busy as it coordinates with other nodes, and phone operating systems like to shut down busy apps to save battery, and so
Sure.
we haven't
So
gone
it's
through
a
all of
problem
the
for
things that we
mobile.
need. Yeah, we haven't focused on that yet, but we're going to have to reawaken the app and do things like that for mobile, and we haven't focused on that yet.
Sure. Yeah. No, I get that. That makes sense.
But it does
Are there
actually
next
run.
steps?
Sorry, it does
Oh,
actually run
wow.
on both iOS and Android. It just gets shut down. So
So you mentioned that you did an ICO. Are you and that funded give us a little bit more understanding of just kind of the business and the business model. You have a foundation that was funded by an ICO and it owns
the
the
foundation
server.
has not. The foundation has not been funded. The foundation was funded, if you will, by Eric and I, the founders, signing over all the intellectual property that we had created around Holo and Holochain. And so the foundation owns all the intellectual property.
Okay.
Holo hosting company did the ICO because it's the one that has a token, has a currency. Holochain doesn't have a currency. And so right now, all of the core Holochain developers that are employed are employees of, well, contractors of um, Holo Limited, the Holo hosting network, right? So right now, Holo is sponsoring the development and launch of both the Holo hosting network and of Holochain. And because it has to have Holochain for Holo's business model to work, right? Like it's
Yes.
fundamental because instead of doing the cloud device virtualization, you have to have the application virtualization, and Holochain is the application virtualization engine.
Okay, that makes sense. And then close the loop on how the funding works with the Holo hosting. I pay into that system and you guys get a cut of
Yeah.
that
So
somehow?
if you are Airbnb that has, what, an $8 million a month contract with Amazon for hosting, or maybe that was a couple of years ago, it's probably more now. Um, so instead of paying a centralized hosting company, you're actually paying a peer hosting network, except you're only paying for the users who are not hosting themselves. If you
Hmm.
get some significant portion of your user base to host themselves, then you don't necessarily have to pay for much at all. Um,
Makes sense.
because it's really only the people that you're serving to only to web browsers rather than who will serve to themselves. So if you think of it about like if you're a company that's doing like a Slack chat type app, you know, you probably want to install that yourself and be synchronizing with other people. So you've got it on your laptop, you can work offline and that kind of stuff, except your folks also want to access it on their phones, right? And so
Hmm.
there you might want to serve to the phones, but how much are they using their phones versus using the desktop? And how heavy is the hosting bill going to be for your, I don't know if it's a small company, your 30 employees using it on their cell phones? Probably small, So um, you get
And then I get it. I like it. Does that mean that if I were to participate in the Holo hosting network, I could make money for participating in it as well?
Exactly. That's what the token is for, it pays
Okay.
the hosts for the hosting. Holo just takes 1% of the transaction.
Okay. Got it. Makes sense. Okay, great. Are there any other next steps on your roadmap that you want to talk about that you're excited about?
I should mention Holochain took a while to go beta. We did go beta back in January. We were making so many revisions and improvements and optimizations and crazy stuff that we were breaking things for people all the time. It's only been stable enough to like build real apps on this year.
Oh, wow.
People have been building apps on it. We just break those apps pretty quickly. We'd been breaking those apps pretty quickly with lots of changes to the internals of Holochain. Um, and so the app, our focus right now is actually getting developers building more apps because as we roll out the Holo hosting network, we actually need apps to run on these thousands of boxes that we've sold, right? Before we can start spilling over into parking lot kiosks and that kind of stuff, we've got to use up the compute power that we already have available to the apps. Um, and Yeah, so next things we will this fall be uh, we're targeting a release of the beta candidate for the hosting network that we will be doing the security audits on and stuff. We've had Holochain security audited, but we have not had the hosting network security audited yet. Um, and so I don't know. Let's see what else.
What would a
There's
when a Web2 developer is looking at where they should start building their app, what should they think about? Why should they choose Holochain over some other blockchain-based option?
scale, speed, no gas fees, cost, right? The ease of that pretty much everything, you know, 80-90% of the development is really just going to be the user experience. What you're going to put on Holochain is the data integrity, the data structures and validation rules largely, right? And so you don't have to be a very big expert on Holochain to be able to do that part. Plus, we have some really great rapid application development tools to scaffold up apps for you. Like at ETH Denver back in February, we did this like DApp in half a day program where people came in and like we demoed different things, and we sat with them as a demo. We in like 25 minutes scaffolded up an Instagram like app, and so it does all the picture storage, all the social connection, immediate notification, different stuff like that. It didn't have all the features of Instagram. It didn't have video feeds and
Sure.
but the but it was a social picture sharing app. We did that, and literally it had the UI and the tests and everything in 25 minutes. It didn't have a lot of validation rules. It wasn't fully pretty. You'd want to tune the UI yourself, but you can actually prototype things very quickly. And speaking of which, we have a hackathon coming up in Amsterdam for people to build things. Um, September 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and then in London the following weekend, last weekend of September, um, and an online dev training where you can learn to build apps in November, like week of November 7th. And so there's a lot of kind of dev activities to support learning. If you want to, if my question is, what have you been dreaming about being able to do on Web3 and haven't been able to find the way? I would bet you can probably do it on Holochain.
Awesome. Okay. I have one tiny follow-up question, which is like, if I am storing my own log of things that I do, my own chain as a user, is there is that difficult to overcome for the developer building the app to get me to install and have that, or is that pretty much figured out at this point? I feel like wallets are still really tricky in Web3 and not figured out properly. And so I just wonder, is there an analog there for you guys in terms of having people hold their own
Yeah.
chain, or is that something you guys have figured out?
Well, again, we may have too many options. Kind of
Okay.
the default option that I like best, and I wish people would do, is install the Holochain launcher, which has inside of it an app store that connects to our dev hub, which is kind of like our decentralized GitHub that you can distribute your apps through. It doesn't have all the features of GitHub yet, but it's a developer space that the developers can distribute their apps through. It binds to the App Store in the launcher, and you can actually just look and see what apps are available and click install, and or you can download a file and install it that way. But that's more steps for a user, right? But to me, I like it because there's an app store, and I think most people kind of have come to understand app stores and installing an app from the app store and that kind of thing. But we have other things. We have a new thing called the Kangaroo, the Holochain Kangaroo, and the idea is it's like the launcher, but it just has one pouch for an app, and you just compile your app right into it, and it's much lighter weight, and it's just a runtime. So you just download an app, it runs that app. You don't really even know you're running Holochain. It's just
Okay.
and then you can package it as an Electron app if you want, or you can, it really kind of depends on what your needs are for your user base. But yeah, you can make it just like you might install the Slack desktop. That's an Electron app, or
Hmm.
things like that. People have gotten to the point that that's a pretty easy experience, pretty easy phenomenon. And if that's the kind of user base you want to serve, they do that, and they don't even know they're serving that they are now a full serving peer in a peer-to-peer network necessarily. You know,
Okay, that's awesome. That's important, honestly, for getting us, bridging us from Web 2
yeah.
to Web 3. I think that's super
Well, that's
important.
part of also why I'm saying the focus is on virtualizing the application, not complex server machine virtualization or something like that, right?
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Um, I believe you guys are located here in the US. You anyway,
I am
ish. Maybe
usually
not.
in the US. I'm in Europe right now for a couple of months going to events. I'm in Austria at the moment for the Crypto Commons gathering. Um, and but I I live in a camper, and it hasn't left the West Coast in the last 2 years. Um,
Oh, that's fun.
so,
Well, so do you have regulatory concerns? I guess is really why I was asking that question. You know,
Holo and Holochain Foundation were incorporated in Gibraltar, and
ah,
we chose
okay.
Gibraltar because of their distributed ledger tech regulations were not focused only on blockchain architectures. They actually abstracted it to decentralized ledger tech, and the regulations fit better with us. But what's interesting, we're not a financial services company. We have no custodial functions of currency for anyone. And so while we submitted ourselves to regulation, the regulators kind of kept, narrowing, honing down, that, well, we don't regulate that, and we don't regulate that, and we don't regulate that. Holochain doesn't have a token, so that doesn't need to be regulated. Holo hosting is about all this content and hosting network and all that. They're like, well, the only part we care about is your reserve accounts, where you can buy Holo Fuel hosting credits with euro or dollars or a cryptocurrency, even though those aren't custodial functions either. It's like, we want to make sure you're not doing price fixing. So we sort of like got all the way down to just the pricing algorithm in our reserve accounts is really the main thing that needs to be regulated. No, I don't have regulatory concerns, and we blocked the U.S. from our ICO. We've never sold on any U.S. exchanges. We've been extremely conservative about the regulatory climate. Yeah.
Would there be something that could change for you to want to be able to serve the US, or are you content to not?
No, we absolutely want to serve the U.S., but not before the network is fully live. We want to have full utility, and so that there's no question as to if you're buying. It's just like when you go to a photography website or you go to Ticketmaster, you buy tickets, right? You don't have the SEC claiming tickets are a speculative token, even though scalpers might be able to sell them for different things or whatever, right? There's an actual thing backing the ticket. And so, because our beta network isn't live, that's why we haven't, you know, done anything with U.S. exchanges yet. We're
Okay,
avoiding
got it.
trouble with the SEC.
Makes sense. Before I ask you our final question, I kind of want to backtrack a little bit because I'm particularly interested in standards, what kind of
Yeah,
standards that we all need to create so that Web3 can work together in the interoperable way that we say that it should.
yeah.
Because practically speaking, we're not really seeing that play out in some ways right now. And so I'm wondering if there are standards or if there are areas that you think that need to be standardized. Maybe not specifically what the standard should be, but the areas that we should be looking at.
Yeah, so I know, about your work with Alexandria and the open index protocol and all that kind of stuff and the graph folks and, so something I forgot to mention is that Holochain DHT also is a graph database. You can build pointers to things on it, and that's actually how you find the data that you need on the DHT is by crawling the graph that you're for being able to find the things that you need. So you build pointer structures for that. You're not primarily following chain history type stuff. You're primarily like finding the node that users are attached to and collecting all the links to the users and then retrieving those things from the DHT. And so our what's a little tricky is Holochain is not monolithic, right? Every application defines its own data structures and its own um, function calls and API, essentially. So it's a little
Hmm.
bit hard to prescribe a, a standard across all applications, but only sort of, because you could you could have data that complies with any kinds of external structures. And so, like we for example have key management available in Holochain, so that you can actually rotate or revoke keys if you had a device stolen and had a key on it, that kind of thing. Um, and we're making our key manager app compatible with web DIDs and being able to be a web DID resolver and produce the web did docs, and that kind of stuff. Um,
Hmm.
and then we have other identity tools like the personas and profiles, which we're probably actually going to make available. Uh, through OAuth as well, but you become your own OAuth host, where Holo Hosting just provides a gateway. Remember, I talked earlier about if somebody provided a gateway, then you could have external things see into the network.
Mm-hmm.
So if Holo Host provides a gateway for this application, you can actually be the host of your own data and define all of your own things and become your own OAuth host essentially. But it's being serviced through a server from, and so there are standards that we are certainly looking to integrate with. I don't know enough really about how to talk about it with like OIP
Oh,
and
not with OIP. I mean, as an industry, and I like where your answer is headed in that it makes sense the for Web3 to conform with Web2 standards to a degree, like you're talking about with OAuth, right? Because
at
then we
least
can
play
just kind of
nice.
pull things over. At least what?
At least play nice.
Right. Yeah. There you go. There you go. For sure. Well, where can people find you guys?
Holochain.org is a great place to start. If you want to know more about the hosting network, that would be holo.host. If you're a developer, you'll find it on holochain.org, but developer.holochain.org. We're on Twitter as Holochain, and we don't actually Discord. If you're a developer, we have a great Discord server for getting support. We have online forums, forum.holochain, forum.holo.host, like all sorts of those tools.
Awesome. All right. So, final question. It's the name of our podcast. What kind of internet do you want?
I want an internet where we have taken back control of our identity and our data, and we don't have to deal with middlemen not of our choosing. Like we can deal with each other directly and don't have all of our relationships managed through others.
The dream. I want that too. Thank you so much, Arthur. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.